Welcome, welcome. I'm John, and today we're talking about Burgundy, specifically for somebody trying to build a real collection. These aren't bottles that you're just drinking. I'm reviewing wines for the market. I'm not reviewing wines that I love. Now, you need to really understand something about Burgundy. It's just complicated in a way that Bordeaux just isn't. In Bordeaux, you learn the first growths, the 5 estates, and that's really it. Maybe the second growths. In Burgundy, there's 33 Grand Cru vineyards. Some have 80 different owners. It's the same dirt, it's the same varietals. We're talking about Pinot Noir for reds and Chardonnay for whites. But the reason for this difference is kind of simple. So Bordeaux classified producers and Burgundy classified land. So this is just fundamentally different. So when you're putting money into wine, the wine that you're going to have for years and decades, you just have to understand the difference. In Burgundy, the vineyard isn't enough. You also need to know who made it. We're going to cover the classification, why producers matter, and what the investment landscape looks like. But we're talking about a place that costs real money. There are other videos on Bordeaux and Champagne and other French regions, but this is the video where I really botched the language. So to my French friends, I totally apologize. To my English-speaking friends, don't try this at home. Now, I also know that this is like packing a ton of information into a short video, and it's not meant to be intimidating. It's really just meant to rattle off the investment level collectibles and give you some context. So drop your questions in the comments and tell me what interests you most about Burgundy. That's a big wind-up, but from Pod Shop Studios in Old London, let's get into it. So first, to understand why Burgundy works the way it does, let's go back 900 years. To the monks. 910 AD, Benedictine monks established the Abbey of Cluny in southern Burgundy. This became some of the first major vineyards in the region. Partly because nobility kept donating land to the church, the thinking was straightforward. Give your monks the best vineyard, and then you improve your odds on Judgment Day. But it was the Cistercians who changed everything. The Cistercian order was founded in 1098 at the Abbey of Citeaux. What happened is that they broke away from the Benedictines. They kind of thought that the Benedictines had gotten a little bit too comfortable and were using money from the church for their own luxury. And the Cistercians took vows of poverty, and they believed that this hard work would bring them closer to God. So now, why does this matter to us? They kept meticulous records. They noticed that different plots of land, even plots of land right next to each other, produced different types of consistency. Year after year, same grapes, same winemaker, but different results. And they started mapping those differences. They called the individual plots climats, and they built walls around the best ones to protect them. Those are called clos. So the most famous project, Clos de Vogüé. So they started acquiring this land around 1109, and by 1336, they'd completed the walls around what is still Burgundy's largest enclosed vineyard. It's about 125 acres. But here's the important part. For about 500 years, Clos de Vogüé was run as a single property. The monks made the wine from different sections and then blended them together. Then came the French Revolution. In 1789, the state seized the church properties. Vineyards that monks had cultivated for centuries were auctioned off. Clos de Vogüé stayed intact for a while. The Ouvrar family owned it through most of the 1800s, but in 1889 it was sold to 6 wine merchants, and then inheritance laws kicked in. The Napoleonic Code was established in 1804, and it required that land be divided equally among all heirs. So generation after generation, these vineyards got subdivided, and subdivided again. So today, Clos de Vogüé has 80 different owners. Some own just a few rows of wines, and maybe it's enough to make a case or two of wine per year. And this is why Burgundy is so fragmented. It's not by design, it's just 200 years of inheritance laws. Here's where it gets interesting for collectors. In 1855, same year that Bordeaux created its very famous classification, a scientist named Jules Laval published a book. It was called History and Statistics of the Vine and Great Wines of the Côte d'Or. Laval mapped every single vineyard, from Chardonnay to Dijon, and he classified those pieces of land into tiers. The tête de cuvée is at the top. Then, première cuvée. then deuxième cuvée, and then troisième cuvée. The top, the first, the second, and the third. But here's the critical difference from Bordeaux. So Laval wasn't ranking estates based on their price or their reputation. He was just like ranking land, and it was based on what it produced. And his top tier, the Tête de Cuvée, became the basis for what we now know as the Grand Cru. His second tier became the Premier Cru. And so when the French government created the official AOC classification in 1936, they went to Laval's work and they used that as the foundation. So it's 170 years later, these rankings still hold up. Romanée Conté was Tête de Cuvée number 1 in 1855. It is still the most expensive in the world. And the monks knew what they were doing. Laval just proved it. All right, let's talk about how the classification actually works. If you're going to collect Burgundy, you need to understand this. There are 4 levels. It just basically forms a pyramid. So let's start at the bottom. These are regional appellations. About 50% of all Burgundy is produced here. And the label is going to say something like Bourgogne or Cremant de Bourgogne or Mâconnais. These can come from grapes grown anywhere in the region. These are going to be cheaper, $15 to $40, and they're meant to be drunk young. And that's not what we're talking about today. The next level up is the village appellations, and this is about 37% of the production. And so these come from productions around a specific village. The label might say Gevrey Chambertin or Vosnay Romanée or Meursault. There's no vineyard name, just the village. In French, we call this village wines, because that is the French word for village. These prices range from like $30 to $150 or more. And by the way, some of these are excellent. So for certain top producers, even village level wines can be worth collecting. Next up, Premier Cru. So about 10% of production, 640 designated Premier Cru vineyards. And the label is going to show the village name, plus the vineyard name, and plus it'll say Premier Cru or 1ER, first cru. So you might see Gevrey Chambertin, Clos, Saint-Jacques, Premier Cru. Now, something important. Some Premier Crus are Grand Crus in everything but name. Clos Saint-Jacques and Gevrey Chambertin, Lazemou Rouge and Chambeau Mouzinet, Cros Paratou and Vosnay Romanée, and that's the vineyard of Henri Jaillet, which he made famous. So these wines are going to cost as much or more than some Grand Crus, and they can absolutely be investment worthy. And then finally at the top, we have the Grand Cru, which is 2% of the total production. There's about 550 hectares all across Burgundy, and there's only 33 vineyards. Here's how you tell on the label. Grand Cru vineyards show only the vineyard name, no village. If it says Chambertin, that's a Grand Cru. The vineyard name just stands alone. All right, here's a concept that trips people up, and I'm going to just use it to tell you something about Burgundy. In Bordeaux, if you buy a Chateau Lafite, you know exactly what you're getting. You're getting this one producer with one wine with a consistent style. In Burgundy, a single Grand Cru vineyard can have dozens of owners. Chambertin is one of the most famous Grand Crus, is divided amongst a few. For example, it has Domaine Armand Rousseau. It has Domaine Leroy. It has Domaine Trappé. And there's others too. They're doing is they're making wine from the same vineyards, but the wines are just not the same. The prices aren't the same. The quality isn't the same. The collectability is different. Burgundy, you're going to need 2 pieces of information. First, you need to know the vineyard, and then you need to know the producer. So write this down, vineyard plus producer, and that's how you identify a Burgundy. Now, there's one exception. It is called a monopole, when one producer owns the entire vineyard outright. By the way, it's just a French word. It means monopoly. Romanée Conti is a monopole. La Tâche is a monopole. Clos des Tartes is a monopole. But these are kind of rare. And by the way, they end up usually being the most valuable wines. They trade at the significant premium because you don't actually have to worry about producer variation. All right, let's talk about what you actually need to know. The vineyards and producers that actually matter for collectors. I'm starting with the vineyard at the absolute top, which is Romanée Conti. This is a 1.8 hectare plot in Vosne Romanée. It's about 4.5 acres. And if you think about it, it's like 5,000 bottles per year. It's owned entirely by Domaine de Romanée Conti, DRC. It's a monopole. This one producer owns all of that land. In 2018, a single bottle of 1945 Romanée Conti sold at Sotheby's for $558,000. It was a world record for a bottle of wine at an auction. And the second bottle from that same lot sold for $496,000, so it wasn't a fluke. And by the way, why 1945? So this is actually the last vintage from the original pre-phylloxera vines, plus the end of the Second World War. And after this 1945 harvest, they pulled out all the old vines and replanted, and only 600 bottles were ever made. Most are long gone. A current vintage, maybe $25,000 at retail, if you can even find it. But DRC just isn't Romanée Conti. The domain has holdings in 8 Grand Cru vineyards. Romanée Conti, La Tâche are their monopoles, but they also have a Richebourg, a Romanée Saint-Vivant, a Chazot, a Grand Chazot, a Corton, and a Montrachet. Every wine that DRC makes is a Grand Cru, though. These are the benchmarks. If you're building a serious Burgundy collection, DRC is going to be part of that conversation. But to be clear, DRC isn't the only name you need to know. You need to know Henri Jayer. He's a legend, like literally. He died in 2006, and his wines have become kind of mythical. He pioneered what is now standard in Burgundy. So there's a cold soak maceration before fermentation, complete destemming, no filtration. But his real legacy is the premier vineyard that is called Cros Panratou. When Jayer acquired it in 1950s, it was just artichokes. It was considered worthless for wine. He had it cleared by hand, literally like with a wheelbarrow, and turned it into one of the most sought-after vineyards in the world. It's not even a Grand Cru. The bottles regularly sell for more than actual Grand Crus, though, to be clear. In 2018, the remaining bottles from Jayer's personal cellar went to auction, and the sale was $34.7 million. It's the largest single wine auction in history. And, for example, a wine faucet from his cellar, which they thought could get $100, got $3,000. Now, his wines are no longer in production, but his nephew, Emmanuel Rouget, continues work in the vineyards. Anything with Henri Jayer's name on it is now a collector's item, and the prices reflect that, but don't sleep on Rouget. He learned from his uncle. He took over the production, and any Jayer you drink from the last 40 years has his fingerprints on it, or even his name. And he's been producing off the same lands using these methods, and he's been doing this now for decades. Other producers that you are just going to need to learn and have to know their names. Domaine Leroy. Lalou Bise Leroy was co-director of DRC until 1992. She was the pioneer of biodynamic viticulture, and her wines from Mâconnais and other Grand Crus are amongst the most expensive in the world. Domaine Armand Rousseau, the premier producer in Gevrey-Chambertin. This topped the list of Livec's Power 100 in 2019, and their Chambertin and Chambertin Clos des Baies are benchmarks. Domaine, Comte Georges de Vogüé. They own about 70% of the Mâconnais Grand Cru. And their Mâconnais, Via Venue, these are called old vines, Vieille Vigne. It's just legendary. And then there's some rising producers that are just seriously worth watching. Domaine Oudelot Noëlla, Domaine Fourier, Domaine Méocamuse, Domaine Dujac. These aren't budget wines, but they're more accessible than DRC, and they've been showing some real strong appreciation. Here's the key point. In Burgundy, the producer reputation is everything. In the same Grand Cru vineyard, 2 different producers can be a 10x price difference. So you're not just buying land, you're buying the person who farmed it and then made the wine. All right, let's talk numbers. If you're thinking about Burgundy as part of your collection, you should understand the market. The Livex Burgundy 150 Index tracks prices throughout most traded Burgundy wines. Since inception, it's up 650%. So that makes Burgundy the best performing wine region for investment, which outperforms Bordeaux, Italy, Champagne, and everything. In 2022, the index hit an all-time high. Now there's been a pullback ever since with a slight uptake at the end of 2025. During 2023 and 24, post-pandemic, most collectibles, including wine, went down. But the long-term return has been pretty strong. So let me give you an example. A DRC Romanée Conti from the 1990 vintage is up 3,000% in the last 20 years. Begs the question, why does Burgundy outperform? Well, first is just structural scarcity. So you can't plant more than one Grand Cru vineyard. Boundaries were set up centuries ago. So there's not going to be any more Romanée Conti or more Chambertin. In Bordeaux, estates buy adjacent land. Or Napa, you get new vineyards planted every year. Second reason is a tiny production. DRC Romanée Conti is 450 cases a year. Chateau Lafite makes 20,000. It's like 40 to 1. When demand increases, there's almost no supply elasticity. Third, global demand. The Asian market, particularly Hong Kong and Japan, have had enormous growth in Burgundy prices. And these are the collectors who just want the best and they're willing to pay for it. Fourth, fragmented ownership. The vineyards are just split amongst so many producers that no single seller can flood the market. This is just structurally different than Bordeaux, where a chateau can release its library stock, for example. For collectors, here's how I like to think about it in terms of investment tiers. At your top tier, you're going to have museum pieces. So this is your DRC Romanée Conti, La Tâche, Henri Jaillet, anything. These are going to be like $25,000 more or less per bottle or more. These are just trophy wines and they appreciate, but this entry level is like super high and your liquidity can be a little bit tricky. The next tier is kind of premier collectible. These are DRC's lesser wines. The DRC Echezot, the Grand Echezot, Armand Rousseau Chambertin, Leroy Grand Crus, Vogüé, Musigny, Vogüé. These are like $500, $5,000 a bottle. And this is like where serious collectors actually focus usually. Then you have your entry-level wines. So these are the top producers' premier crus or rising producers' Grand Crus. These are up to about $500 a bottle. But you're buying quality from respected names, but there's some room for growth. What is it that's driving these values? Well, one is the producer reputation. So remember, same vineyard, different producer, completely different prices. Learn the names of the producers. Vintage is super important. Great vintages, 2005, 9, 10, 15, 16, 18, 19, 20. And the challenging vintages, 2011, 13, 21, 2004. The market has a long memory, and the weaker vintages are going to trade at a discount. Your provenance is super important. It is just super important, even more so than Bordeaux. Pinot Noir is delicate. It's temperature sensitive. A bottle stored improperly won't just taste worse, it will be completely destroyed. You need documentation. Ex-cellar, professional storage, that gets a premium. Condition matters. The OWCs, the original wooden cases, are preferred. Magnums age better, and those are actually more valuable per unit. Label condition matters, especially for older vintages. By the way, one more thing on investment in Burgundy. Counterfeit problem. Burgundy is heavily faked. DRC and Jaillet especially. Remember I told you about that 1945 DRC that went for $558,000? 600 bottles were made, but thousands have been sold. Think about that. Buy only from impeccable sources. You need established auction houses, retailers with documented provenance. And by the way, if the deal looks too good to be true, it probably is. So do you need to actually buy these Grand Crus? And the answer is probably not. So if you're just starting your collection, you just don't need to do this. And at $300, $25,000 per bottle, the capital is just significant. Burgundy's appeal is its subtlety. So the difference between a great Gevrey Chambertin and a great Chambeau Musigny is just nuanced, and so you need experience, you need reps. If your palate is still developing, you're just not going to get the full value out of a $500 bottles of wine. You just get way more out of 10 bottles at $50 a bottle. When does this start making sense? Scenario 1, it's a milestone bottle. You want one bottle from a significant year, your birth year, your wedding year, something that's meaningful. You're going to cellar it for a decade or more. In that case, a single bottle from a respected producer makes sense. It's not really an investment play, it's just personal. So scenario 2, you want to experience the benchmark, not to collect, but just to understand. My advice, find a restaurant or a wine bar with a strong by the glass program. They'll use a Coravin, and they will be able to extract just a small taste for you. Spending several hundreds of dollars on a tasting glass of DRC, then you could feel what everybody's chasing, and then you only have to do that one time. Scenario 3, you're committing to a long-term investment position. You have $5,000, $10,000 that you can allocate to a wine that you're not going to touch for a decade. You're buying the original wooden cases. You're storing it professionally. You're documenting everything. That's legitimate. Burgundy has the track record to support it. But assuming none of those things apply, here's what I recommend. Start with village wines from top producers. Gevrey Chambertin Village from Armand Rousseau, Vosne Romanée Village from Mayo Cazomé. These are $70, $80, $150 maximum wines, and they're excellent, and they're going to teach you about the Burgundy terroir and what it actually tastes like. And then look for premier crus from rising producers. So I mentioned them earlier, but Oudelot Noëlla, Domaine Fourier, Domaine Sylvain Cater. $150, $300 maximum. And these have strong appreciation. And these are quality without that kind of prestige premium. And then start exploring the value region. Côte Chalonnaise, Gevrey, Mercurey, Roumier. They make the serious Pinot and a Chardonnay at a fraction of the price of the neighboring Côte d'Or prices. Saint-Véran, Ypouille-Foussé for whites. These aren't investment wines, but they're just great drinking and they're really good for learning. The point is you just don't need to spend $500 to understand Burgundy. Just taste widely, learn the differences, and all those big purchases could come later. All right, let's just say that you're ready to buy. Here's how to do it. If you're buying to drink and learn, go to reputable retailers with proper wine storage. Canal Wines, Berry Brothers Rudd, they opened a U.S. store in 2025. Local wine shops with temperature-controlled cellars. Look for recent vintages from the producers we talked about. Don't overthink this. If you're buying to collect or to invest, these rules are just going to be different. Okay, here's your first rule. You're going to buy original wooden cases. These will be designated as OWC. And when you go to resell, the buyers are going to want to know that the bottles haven't been handled. So a 6-pack in OWC untouched is worth way more than 6 loose bottles of the same wine. Rule 2, professional storage from day 1, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 70% humidity, no vibration, no light. And if you're storing this stuff at home, you just really need a proper wine fridge or cellar. You do not put these in a kitchen rack, please. Use a professional facility if you're serious. There are a number of companies, Wovo, Vinfolio, and others will help you hold the wine in ideal conditions, and they'll maintain the chain of custody. Rule 3, document everything. You want your receipts. You want your storage records. You want your temperature logs. The value of your Burgundy is directly tied to provenance. And so if you can't prove where the bottle's been, its value is just going to drop. Rule 4, think in 5, 10, 15, 20-year horizons. Burgundies reward patience. You're just not going to be able to flip it in a year. Rule 5, great vintages plus top producers is the formula. Don't chase obscure vintages or unknown producers if you're just doing this for investment. Where to buy? Auction houses are actually the premier market for rare Burgundy. So Sotheby's, Christie's, Heritage, Acker, Maryland, Condit. The advantage is the access to older vintages and verified provenance. The downside is you are going to pay buyer's premium and there could be some competition. Specialist retailers like Berry Brothers and Rudd and Farr and Fine and Rare. And these are merchants who deal in investment grade wines and they can help you build up your position over time. Imprimu is buying futures, and that does exist in Burgundy, but it's a little trickier than Bordeaux. Your allocations are super tiny and you need a relationship with a specific importer or retailer to access them. Here's some red flags. Your prices are just significantly below market. So if somebody's selling you a Romanée Comté for 30% under retail, something is wrong. Unknown storage history. My grandfather kept these in the basement is not provenance. Private sales without documentation. If there's not paperwork, just walk away. Check fill levels, look for low fill levels, or damaged labels. That is actually something that's super important in Burgundy. And be careful with anybody who claims to have large quantities. DRC makes 450 cases or Romanée Conté a year. So if somebody has a full case just sitting around, you've got some questions to ask. Here's why this all matters, even if you never buy a Grand Cru Burgundy. Understanding this system tells you how to think about wine quality. The monks figured this out like in the year 900, that the land matters, and Laval proved it in 1855. And by the way, the market is validating this every day. This framework, the terroir, that creates consistent replicable quality, climat, has influenced other wine regions around the world. Look at Oregon Willamette Valley, New Zealand Central Otago, California Russian River Valley. They are all just chasing the same thing Burgundy established. When you look at any wine list, any auction catalog, any collection, you'll understand why things are priced the way they are. Now you know what Grand Cru means and what it doesn't. You know to ask about producers and not just the vineyards, and you also know to care about provenance, storage, and documentation, because those things are going to matter for any wine that you're planning on keeping with any idea of selling it in the future. Listen, Burgundy has a reputation for being complicated and exclusive, and honestly, it can be a little bit of both. But the fundamentals aren't really that hard. There's 33 Grand Cru vineyards. They're classified by land, not producer. You're going to learn the top names. You're going to understand that vineyard plus producer equals wine. And if you're going to invest, buy the great vintages, store it properly, and document everything. But you don't need Burgundy Grand Crus to be a serious collector. It's just understanding it that will make you a better collector. So if this was helpful, subscribe. Just drop a comment below. Tell me what Burgundy producer you're most curious about, or if you found something that's really exciting. Just tell me what's on your wish list. Cheers.